From KCBS Radio in San Francisco, I'm Matt Pitman, and this is Bay Current for Monday, January 17th, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That's the very familiar sound of the church bells at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco's Nob Hill neighborhood. The majestic, iconic landmark on California Street, situated between Taylor and Jones. And I didn't have to venture far to record the bells, which toll every hour. Actually, I just opened a window. I live right across the street from Grace Cathedral. In the summer of 2020, with everything shut down because of COVID, the grand staircase in front of Grace Cathedral became kind of like a neighborhood gym. It was a way to get some exercise and some fresh air. One day I noticed a new banner hanging out by the staircase in front of the church. This was during the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the awakened social justice gatherings going on around the city and the country. Above the words, "Black Lives Matter," the sign bore a well-known quote and a notation: Dr. Martin Luther King, March 28th, 1965, at Grace Cathedral. And that quote?
"Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
I was moved, blown away really, that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had spoken at this majestic building right outside my front door. So this year on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I connected with someone who was there at Grace Cathedral on March 28th, 1965.
My name is Michael Lampen. I'm the cathedral archivist at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. It's the Episcopal Cathedral for the Bay Area. And I've been here officially since 1982, but I started as a chorister in 1956. So I've seen a lot of change and a lot of progress at the cathedral.
And a lot of history.
And a whole lot of history, and I'm hopefully going to get that down in physical word form over the next few years. I'm working on it right now.
Michael graciously spoke with me in his office inside Grace Cathedral. He calls it the Crypt. It's a masterwork of utilizing space. Shelves, cabinets, tables, all stacked full of books, documents, blueprints, photographs, audio recordings, you name it. It was the perfect setting for this conversation. Take me back to March 28th, 1965. That's a historic day for Grace Cathedral. Dr. Martin Luther King delivered a lengthy sermon right here. Tell me how that all came about.
Bishop Pike and Martin Luther King were friends going way back when Pike was the dean of St. John of the Divine Cathedral in New York. And they corresponded a lot. They probably met a lot and exchanged views and so forth. Bishop Pike became quite a radical in his views.
Bishop Pike was the Archbishop of the
Diocese of California, which is the Bay Area, in 1958.
Okay.
Before that, he was dean at St. John of the Divine, New York.
Man, wow.
But after the cathedral was consecrated, essentially finished in 1964, and they wanted to have some ongoing theme, which they called Festivals of Grace, into the following years to keep the cathedral in the public eye, I suppose, mainly. And so they wanted a series of important visitors, and among them, of course, was Duke Ellington. Mm-hmm. But of course, Martin Luther King was the main prize. Mm-hmm. And so Bishop Pike wrote to him, and he agreed to come. So that's how we got him.
And so at that time, 1965, that entire period of the 60s, especially the second half of the 60s, was just such a transformative time in our nation's history.
Very turbulent,
so much of what Dr. King had to say in that sermon here at Grace Cathedral was very much the pulse of what was going on in the country.
Absolutely, yeah. And
you were here.
Well, I started as a little baby chorister in 1956, age 9. But by the time Martin Luther King arrived, I was 18 and I was an alto in the back rows. Mm-hmm. But I was about 40 feet behind him in the stall, choir stalls, listening to him. He had as you've heard him, he had a wonderful, deep, rich voice and a very commanding presence. But there was a lot of worry about his security, so there was a Secret Service person behind him in the pulpit, one below the pulpit, and probably a few others scattered through the building. But the cathedral was full. I've never seen it as full as that. The only other time it was that full was after the 9/11 events. A friend and I managed to sneak out before the service started, and we wandered out into the parking lot, which is now the courtyard, full of people, and into the cathedral offices in front of the cathedrals, absolutely full of people. And they had sort of a primitive sound system so people could hear what the sermon was and so forth. And so we scurried back in. We almost didn't get back in, but we managed to get back in and get into the choir and participate.
What do you remember about the parts of the speech that maybe stand out to you? And again, knowing that you were busy, you were trying to keep track of your program and everything like that, but...
He quoted this poem by Douglas Malloch, or Malloch, rather. The essence of it was, if you can't be a tree, be a bush. Be the best of whatever you can be.
He must come to see that whatever he is called to do has significance if it is for the making of a better world. So if you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley. But be the best little scrub on the side of the rail. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are.
And that was a part of the central theme of his sermon. Everybody can aspire, but you can do something about it, and you can be as best as you can be in the right way.
Right.
I could read you a little bit about Dean Bartlett's experience of his being here.
I'd love to hear it.
Interested?
And this is from an oral history that you conducted with Dean Bartlett, is that right?
That's right. Bishop Pike, being an old friend of Martin Luther King, wrote him and asked him if he would come here to preach. He accepted the invitation, and the time of his visit was set for March 28th, which was a Sunday during Lent of that year. He arrived here, was shrouded in all kinds of structure on the part of the San Francisco police force, who were responsible for his security. He brought a number of members of his staff, no personal bodyguard. Let's move down here a little bit. We had been in close contact with the police force, the chief of police and his principal lieutenants, as to what we should do here. They felt there should be uniformed men around in case anything should happen. And they say, well, who the dickens are you to be ordering me around? I want to go that way. But they did have plainclothesmen here to augment the total number, of one of whom was right in front of Dr. King and me. But let me read you the part. This is quite interesting. We followed our Lenten tradition then of a litany sung in procession, winding through all the aisles of the cathedral, and then up the center aisle, down the south aisle, back up the center, into the choir. And all that exposure to a crowd pressing in who had to separate to let the procession through. The crowd was so enormous that the fire marshal and his henchmen, who were here on duty early, closed the doors of the cathedral, I think, before 10:30. About 20 minutes after that, they closed the doors and said, you cannot have any more people in the cathedral. They were jammed out on the plaza, which is in front of the cathedral, and down the sidewalk right into California Street, basically. Well, the choir and the procession and the clergy had to pick their way through this crowd inside, singing the litany. And here King and I were bringing up the rear, and I confess that how easy it would have been for somebody to jump out of that crowd and plunge a knife into King and Bartlett. And I had anxieties going around that procession so close to so many people, but nothing unhappy happened. We got into the great choir and got time for the sermon. The King was escorted to the pulpit. The police force insisted on having a plainclothesman down on the pavement in front of the pulpit where he could survey at close range anybody within close distance of King. Another one behind him. King preached a marvelous sermon. He was a great orator. In the middle of the sermon, I happened to look up out of just sort of ecstasy, just looking up and thinking how marvelous this whole thing was. And what should I see on the catwalk on the top of the cathedral but a body moving around up there? My heart went into my throat, and I said, my God, somebody's been up there with a pistol. So I called Charles Agnew, the verger, over, and I said, get up to the catwalk fast and see who that is moving up there. He came back down in a few minutes and said, dean, it was a young man from the seminary in Berkeley taking photos. And I told him he'd better get off the catwalk in a hurry before the cops got him instead of something else. So that was an anxious moment. It came time for the offering to be taken. Of course, our ushers were augmented by many extra volunteers from this enormous crowd. I'm estimating conservatively that there had to be between 3,500 and 4,000 people in the cathedral. That's about twice the normal capacity that's supposed to be allowed in the building. Outside, this mob of people behaved very well, incidentally, but still, the ushers were taking up the offering inside and from the crowd outside. Incidentally, we had speakers rigged so the outside could hear what was going on, and they heard that the offering was being taken and began to shout, "Where are the offering takers for out here? Send us the offering takers." The police department had taken a whole floor at the Hilton Hotel for King, and about 3 or 4 of his staff people who were there with him, but they had all of the stairways manned on a 24-hour basis. The elevators were not permitted to stop unless they had an authorized person in the car calling for the stop. Then only these getting off. The police did a marvelous job of security for him, and unfortunately a tragedy did not happen here, such as happened at Memphis later. Well, that was an exciting day for Grace Cathedral and the whole city.
Certainly was. Incredible. So in terms of where this registers in the great history of this church and this site, having Dr. King speak here in March of 1965, where would you unofficially rank that?
I'd rank that way up near the top somewhere. It's sort of a wakening up of Grace Cathedral's social conscience. And with this event, this Bishop Pike and Martin Luther King event, we began to pivot from more of a parish church, perhaps more ordered, more structured, to something much more personally involving, I would say, perhaps.
So it sounds like Dr. King being here, March 1965, was a transformative moment for Grace Cathedral, the church, in terms of its pivot, the word you've used a couple of times now, towards more inclusion and reflecting the values of the community.
Right. Well, I think the whole country was changing.
Absolutely.
So we were changing with it.
How much of the initiatives that the church undertakes today, that the cathedral undertakes today, can be kind of directly related back to that event in 1965 with Dr. King being here?
It's interesting. A couple of months ago, during this lockdown period, the cathedral staff had a structural racism training series, which was very helpful for us. I learned quite a few things about racism and personal things that I took for granted that are actually racist.
Like the conscious and unconscious biases and things like that, right?
Exactly. So I think a lot of this all of this goes back to King, really, I would say.
Michael, this was a fascinating conversation and trip down memory lane, and just the opportunity to reflect a little bit on history, our shared history as a country, as a people, but especially in this neighborhood and in this city, in this region, in San Francisco and the Bay Area. So thank you for your time and your insights. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you again to Michael Lampen, the archivist at Grace Cathedral. To watch Dr. King's entire speech from March 28, 1965 at Grace Cathedral, I've put a link to their YouTube page in the show notes of this podcast. There's also a link to the KCBS Radio YouTube page where you can find every episode of Bay Current. And we invite you to subscribe to the Bay Current podcast. We have new episodes every day, and we'd love to be part of your routine. Subscribe on the Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or just about anywhere you listen. And thank you for listening. I'm Matt Pitman. We'll chat with you again tomorrow.